there, deadly assaults have increased in Afghanistan, and the U.S. launched an airstrike against Taliban fighters. The strike came 4 days after U.S. and Taliban negotiators signed a historic agreement meant to end 19 years of war in Afghanistan and allow Trump to begin the promised withdrawal of U.S. troops. So, is the peace deal already falling apart? Can Trump complete a U.S. departure and end its longest war? And how will the Afghanistan government stand without the backing of U.S. troops? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Richard Chasty, professor lecturer from the George Washington University in D.C., Laruma Nasri, co-founder and vice president of the Afghanistan Justice Organization in Kabul, and Wang Jin, associate professor of Northwest University of China. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here. While the ink of the agreement, ceasefire agreement, is still wet, the U.S. launched an airstrike against the Taliban. What do you think of the irony here? Let me first ask Laruma.
Well, I think the agreement between Taliban and the U.S. government, despite being very vague throughout the contents, I think there are other contrasts as well. The U.S. government has a strategic agreement with the Afghan government, and it states that whenever needed, the U.S. government will protect Afghanistan. Besides, the U.S. government has a recent agreement with the Taliban group, which does not have any legitimacy. And there are many commitments being placed in the agreement. Looking at these two agreements between parties, I think the contrast increases, and it looks like the fulfillment of the agreement and the success of the agreement will not be as expected. Taliban, after a week of reduction in violence, started attacking the Afghan forces again, and they announced that they will continue violence against the Afghan forces and the Afghan people, but they will stop violence against or any attacks against the U.S. government. This is not part of a successful peace process for us, the Afghan people, and we think that this agreement will not reach anywhere if things go on as this.
So it's a big if about the unpredictability in Afghanistan between U.S. troops and the Taliban. Richard, once the attacks were meant to be defensive, according to a spokesperson of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, what do you think of the irony here? Is it an issue of commitment by the U.S. troops, and what if the ceasefire deal has been inked between the two sides? What does that mean for the reputation and credibility for both sides?
Well, we have to remember that this agreement that was reached in Doha, Qatar, was done without the involvement of the Ashraf Ghani government. And on the one hand, if you're looking at the beginnings of the negotiation process, that might have been an advantage. But now that this has been inked, this is clearly a problem. And the Americans do have defensive commitments to the Ashraf Ghani government, and yet at the same time, they have got to work to ensure that this agreement has at least the possibility of gaining traction on the ground. Now, the other issue that I think is critical is the September elections, which Ashraf Ghani received 50.64%, barely over the 50% mark, while Abdullah, the chief executive, I think it was around 39.5%, and Abdullah has declared himself president. If he forms a parallel government The issue now is how does that really affect the overall process? Which government would the Taliban negotiate with starting on March 10th, presumably?
Dr. Wang Jin, let's look at the wording and the ambiguity, quote-unquote, concerning the contents of the deal between the Taliban and U.S. troops. Now, why do you think both sides seem to be very careful about calling the agreement a peace deal?
Well, I think we have to go back to the very core meaning of we call it deal or kind of agreement, no matter what the rhetoric we use. But the real meaning, in my personal opinion, is that of this deal or this agreement, it means a lot for the United States, because the United States could use this agreement as a kind of excuse to withdraw their military presence inside Afghanistan back home against, although a lot of the different opinions, a lot of the disagreements from its allies inside Afghanistan and also its allies in the Middle East. So this is actually the kind of Donald Trump, his own excuse to fulfill his promise in the election campaign. I mean, when you know that this year will be the presidential election year, so he hopes to bring the American forces back home from Afghanistan. So this is the kind of excuse that Donald Trump hoped to say, okay, we got this agreement, and on the one hand, we hope to maintain the stability and the security of the Afghanistan government through this kind of agreement, because according to the content that the Taliban and the Afghan government will start a kind of the political negotiation in the future. While on the other hand, it ensures the United States will decrease their military presence in the state. So it is only the kind of political excuse for Donald Trump himself to withdraw the forces. So this is this is why a lot of the ambiguities, a lot of uncertainties inside this agreement and all the peace deals. So that is why this will plant the very, very big bomb in the future for the stability and the security inside Afghanistan, because Donald Trump only cares about himself, not the Afghanistan people.
A look at the content of the deal itself. Now, Laluma, let me know your thoughts. Many observers are concerned that the deal concedes too much to the Taliban without requiring it to make any substantive commitments to ensure a genuine peace process. What do you think?
Well, the Taliban group is an insurgent group. Already given a lot of boost to an insurgent group by the U.S. government in regards to the Afghan peace process by signing this agreement before reaching to any consensus or before reaching to any agreement with the Afghan government. This is one issue. The other thing is the Taliban group does not have the capacity to commit and then also implement the agreement contents. They are a group unless they are part of the government or they are a government to implement the agreement. This issue itself creates a huge contrast, and the execution of the agreement, looking at the contents of the agreement, I don't think so. It's a capacity of an insurgent group in Afghanistan. I think we, the people of Afghanistan, are looking at this agreement as a kind of immature. And after spending more than 18 months having such an agreement, which is vague and which is not in the interests of the people of Afghanistan, I don't think so. It will last if it goes as it is. But we need to. The people of Afghanistan are looking forward to that both the U.S. government, the international community who support the government of Afghanistan, and the countries in the region will support the process and make Taliban agree that they will talk with the Afghan government. The intra-Afghan talks exactly start at the date when when it's mentioned in the agreement, and also they should recognize the government of Afghanistan as a legitimate government and come to talk with it and do the rest of the agreement execution.
Yes, indeed. The inter-Afghan talk between the Taliban and Kabul will be a major issue. Let me ask you very quickly, Laluma, the presidential inauguration for the second term has been postponed. Will it take place as scheduled a few days from now?
I hope I've gotten your question right. I think this is the inauguration of the Afghan government, right?
Yes, indeed.
The inauguration postponed by President Ghani for the second term of presidency is not only because of the demand of the U.S. government to strengthen the peace process, but also there are internal political tensions as a result of the election results present here. So together, all these issues caused postponement of the inauguration of the new government. But at any case, I understand President Ghani has a very clear vision for the peace process in Afghanistan, has a very clear vision about Afghanistan. And if all these tensions are over and finally the inauguration happens and the new government is established under the leadership of the President Ghani, I think what he is looking forward for Afghanistan is to become a powerful economic, security-wise partner and a country in the region that everyone can work with, everyone can benefit from, because we all know that peaceful Afghanistan, a strong Afghanistan is in the benefit of region, and we also require the cooperation of the region for the current peace process to be successful. In general, I think there are internal and external issues that has postponed the inauguration, and we, at this moment, we don't know what is next, but we are hopeful that the inauguration happens.
Richard, do you understand why the Taliban refuses to talk to Kabul, I mean the Afghan government, and refuses to accept the legitimacy of the elected presidency of Mr. Ghani? How difficult will it be for the two sides to reach a political compromise so that peace can be sustained in this war-torn, landlocked country?
Well, this is going to require what are called confidence-building measures on the part of the international community and on the part, eventually, of the United States. The international community is going to have to be supportive financially and otherwise of the agreement process. And there have to be confidence-building measures inserted through the process of the negotiation to ensure that there are incentives for both parties to continue talks. At some point, you know, in a negotiation process, parties that enter and sustain talks had to have reached a hurting stalemate where the existing situation becomes intolerable. And that, coupled with the type of confidence-building measures that are required and that would serve as inducements to continue with the process, are critical. So this is a negotiation process that's fraught with obstacles, with roadblocks, and it has to be nurtured in a very carefully reasoned way to ensure that both sides understand the significance of walking away and the significance of staying with the process. And I think that Zalmay Khalilzad is the right person for this. He He has a good rapport with Mullah Baradar and with Taliban representatives. He's an extremely determined and an extremely thoughtful individual, and that may have made the big difference in terms of why this Trump initiative was successful while others were not, coupled with the fact that the Afghan government, at least in these beginning stages, has been excluded from an agreement. I think that was probably a wise step on the part of the Americans, at least in the beginning. But the hope is that this will build momentum so that the thought of walking away from the process becomes unthinkable. That is, I think, the hope in any case.
We are wondering, Richard, how do other members of the NATO respond to the unilateral decision by President Trump to have this military drawdown in Afghanistan? Because 19 years ago, it's the United States that led to the invasion of Afghanistan and toppled the Taliban in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks. Member states such as Germany, France, the UK were actively involved in their support of the US-led invasion. But how do they respond to the latest development in Afghanistan?
Well, I haven't heard or read of any dissent that's notable among NATO participants. And my guess is, as part of this agreement, there is a NATO drawdown as well as an American force drawdown from some 12,000 troops, at least in the initial phase, to roughly 8,600. There are certain issues that remain, however. Some have called for an additional or a remaining 5,000 to continue with training with the Afghan forces. And another 2,000.
Do you think the Afghan security forces are reliable? I was, so far as I'm concerned, a few years ago, for example, there were attacks from within these Afghan security forces by the Taliban. I mean, militias who identified themselves as the security forces, and they launched the terrorist attacks and killed many government soldiers. Do you think this will likely continue?
That has been a problem, and this seems to be a role that NATO can play in terms of supervision of continued training and monitor and oversight functions of the Afghan security forces to ensure that this type of activity is kept to a minimum.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Dr. Wang Jin. Dr. Wang, without the backing of the U.S. troops, I mean, a few months from now, are you sure that the government in Kabul will be able to control or maintain the security in other parts of the country? Because I know, at least a couple of years back, the Taliban was able to control a big chunk, if not most of the territory in Afghanistan. And we all know that the Pashtun tribe is the major home to the Taliban. And the Taliban, of course, is composed of moderates and radicals, by the way. But what do you think of the ability by the government in Kabul to control the situation in general?
I think it's very difficult to say, because if we look back what is happening now, we have to know that there were a lot of frictions and divisions, even inside the Afghanistan government. And if we have to know that right now the government, the frictions inside the Afghanistan government not only lies in the Afghanistan central government level, but also lies in the divisions between the central government and the local government levels. So if you look back what is happening and what has been happening in recent years, the divisions between the central government and the local government, they came to appearance as, time after time, because some of the local generals, some of the local the leaders, they disagree with the opinion, they disagree with the decisions from the central government, so they can maintain their kind of the self-independence. So they have their own forces, military forces. They have their own networks, social networks in the local level. So actually, this division is very big. So that is why it makes the Taliban government to sustain the stability themselves, to maintain their security themselves, because they have their own frictions. And this kind of the frictions and divisions for themselves could be used as kind of a manner from the Taliban to attack them, to make their stability in the social orders collapse. So that is why I'm not very confident over what might happen in the future, because Taliban is actually, they have the strong military forces, as you mentioned, that they enjoy very support from the Pashto people in the central and southern Afghanistan, and also they are now penetrating into the northern Afghanistan, where is traditionally they are not the very Pashto people lived area. They are other people, Tajik and Uzbek people, but now they have
the Northern League
presence
in North Afghanistan. But let me go back to Richard. Richard, the Taliban emerged pretty strong during the Soviet occupation at the height of the Cold War, and the Taliban did enjoy support not only from the United States but also China. By the way, China was in fact a semi-ally of the Americans in defeating the Soviets during the Soviet occupation there. The Taliban is known notoriously for its religious extremes of Wahhabism, and the Taliban opposes vehemently access to education by young women and girls in a country like Afghanistan. So what will happen to women in Afghanistan should government in Kabul fail to fend off the attacks of the Taliban? Will it be a difficult situation for women in this country to continue to enjoy fair opportunities like equal access to education and jobs?
Well, this is a very serious problem, and it's one of the issues that remain of real concern, and it will require a continuous discussion with Taliban leaders in terms of how to proceed. I mean, part of the issue here is this religious bent, which is discriminatory against women. And if the Taliban do become part of a consociational agreement in terms of power sharing, these are dynamics that are going to have to be dealt with, and the prospect of inclusion and tolerance is going to have to be leveraged in terms of the type of economic and political support that the Taliban can receive. It's a daunting task, and I'm not optimistic about that, but if there are compelling economic and political incentives to modify this rigid stance, then perhaps some headway can be made in the process.
Let me go back to Laluma. Madam Laluma, you are a woman, of course, and you are a successful woman. We are so proud of you in a country like Afghanistan. It must be quite an effort for you to win recognition in the society. Let me know, are you concerned about your own safety should the Taliban make a strong comeback? And are you sure that women like you, girls like you in Afghanistan would be able to enjoy equal opportunity for education? I was impressed a few years ago by a photo, a gruesome photo, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photo that delivers a girl of your country whose nose was cut off simply because of her serious yearning for good education and for decent citizenship in a civilized country, but her face was savaged by the Taliban. Do you think this gruesome picture will happen? We are seriously concerned about the well-being of women in your country in the future.
Well, looking at the history of Taliban's rule in Afghanistan and looking at the current situation, when we see comments from the Taliban leadership through the media, there is no hope that there will be change, and there is no hope that things will get better. But Taliban always claim that they will give women's rights based on the Sharia law and based on the customs accepted in Afghan society. Now, their interpretation of the Sharia is different than what Sharia and what Islam has given as rights to women. Women in Afghanistan, including me, and even those women who are not working outside their houses, used all available platforms to raise our voices with international community, with Afghan government, and also even in the informal dialogue that took place in Doha between the Taliban and the people of representative of the people of Afghanistan some time back, that Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan, and particularly women, we do not want to go back. We have gained a lot in the last 18, 19 years, and we don't want to sacrifice those gains. The Taliban must accept that the women's rights and the gains that we have got in the last so many years, and that's why we support the Afghan government to be in the negotiations process and to be in the included in the process, so that the gains and the rights of the women of Afghanistan are ensured, and we are represented there. It's unfortunate that we saw the agreement, and I'm sure you have read it as well, that we read the agreement and there is no mention of women's rights, human rights, the future of Afghanistan, the democracy, and nothing that could ensure to the people of Afghanistan that this agreement between the Taliban and the U.S. government is in the benefit of Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Laluma. Thank you so much. Let me go to cross over to Dr. Wang Jin. Before we conclude this meaningful discussion here, Dr. Wang, and the representation of women in the Afghan politics will be a big issue, of course, which is looming larger with the signing of the agreement between the two sides. Now, I'd like to know more about the Chinese participation in the post-war reconstruction. China's been involved in this process of reconstruction. The moment, the U.S. toppled the Taliban 90 years ago. But let me know more about this. And the other issue, very quickly, I don't know whether you have enough time, the relationship between Taliban in Pakistan and that in Afghanistan, and also the concern by the Indian government because of the role of the inter-service forces of the Pakistani government. But first of all, what can you tell us about the Chinese participation in support of the deal?
Yeah, China has already made a lot of efforts, made a lot of the contributions and assistance to the reconstruction process of Afghanistan. And I have to say that in short, in the future, China will do more. And China will continue to play the very active, constructive role in the peace process of Afghanistan, and also in the reconstruction, the peace process of Afghanistan. Because on the one hand, China has a very positive ties with nearly all the related Afghanistan issue countries, for example, United States, Russia, Iran, and also Pakistan, India. But on the other hand, China has a very positive image among the
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. Thank you so much. Exit strategy is, of course, an important part of a war. Given the military might of the U.S., it's easy for them to defeat the weak enemy. However, post-war reconstruction is always a big issue. Thank you for watching this program. See you next time. Goodbye.